Hello and welcome. We are so excited for you to join us for our fourth session of the Triton Talks webinar series. This is going by fast. We'll be hearing about part of the Triton Initiative's environmental monitoring field trials campaign today from a wonderful environmental engineer, Molly Grear. She'll be diving into PNNL's research in understanding the field strength and spatial patterns associated with marine energy to determine how EMF might be impacting the marine environment. Just a few logistical notes for attendees today. We are using a Zoom webinar setup and have muted you to ensure that there are no interruptions during the presentation. If you do have questions that come up, like I said, please put them into the chat. We love hearing your questions and we really encourage it. And I'll read them during the Q&A session after the presentation. We'll also be including helpful links to resources and relevant articles in the chat. So keep your eye out for those. We have lots of resources. We are recording this webinar and we'll later post it on our recorded video on YouTube in our Triton Talks playlist. So if you'd like to reference it later or share it or view a webinar that you missed, you can find it there. A little bit about our presenter today. Molly Grear is an ocean engineer in the Marine Energy Group of the Coastal Sciences Division at PNNL. Her recent work focuses on power ocean observing technologies with marine energy, the environmental impacts of marine energy, and coastal community energy resilience. We're really thankful for you doing this research, Molly. And we're excited to hear from you today. So I will pass the mic over to you.
Thanks so much, Nalani. I wanted to say before I get started that I'm calling in from a public space today. So if you hear any sort of noise in the background, that's why. First, I want to introduce to you a little bit about electromagnetic fields at marine energy sites. Electromagnetic fields are created as you create energy, or they're emitted as you create energy or electricity from a tidal turbine or a wave energy device. Then as the electricity is sent back to shore, surrounding the cable, you get a magnetic field. Most of the electric field or all of the electric field is typically contained within the cable. So usually when we're talking about EMF, we're actually interested in understanding the effect of the magnetic field. One of the reasons that this is important is because lots of critters in the ocean use magnetic fields. They might use them to detect prey or to navigate, and we're not sure how these magnetic fields might impact their life history. And so we want to make sure that this industry isn't having an adverse effect on those organisms. Next slide. So with our Triton field trials, we wanted to try to provide ways, sort of standardized ways that we could measure magnetic fields at marine energy sites. So what we did was we used the tidal energy site that's right outside our door in our swim facility, which has tidal currents that are up to about 2 meters per second. We evaluated and tested multiple devices for measuring EMF and analyze that data to make recommendations for how best to measure the magnetic field. Next slide. So the two instruments that we tested were a commercially available Overhauser magnetometer called the C-SPY 2, which is in this picture, is in the bottom, the larger orange device. And then we also had a modified YOST inertial measurement unit, which we sort of customized to test for magnetic fields. The YOST was very inexpensive, but required a little bit of tinkering. You can see it in the top of this picture. It's actually inside that little Nerf football. And so we wanted to see how well that compared to the commercially available, commercial off-the-shelf system. Next slide. So we first put a cable out in Swim Bay and a sort of this modified, or this put this cable out with the voltage and current that would be expected with a tidal turbine. What we found in these initial testings, we did a transect survey to understand what that cable was what kind of magnetic field it was producing. And what we found was that the site in Swim Bay is actually really variable. So you can see in this picture here that the magnetic field right around our lab, which is the little star called mackerel, varies by about 100 nanoteslas, which is way more than the typical signature, the magnitude of a cable. And so what we found out in this initial testing is that we really needed to understand the background magnetic field to successfully detect cables and understand the impact that cables might be having in the sort of natural variation of the magnetic field. So after those initial sort of preliminary surveys, we designed a test grid in SCWMB to test if the magnetic field was varying day to day. And we also tested a couple of instruments to better understand the position of the C-SPY2 and see if that improved our data quality. Okay, next slide. So these three figures that you see here on A, B, and C, they are the results of our magnetic field survey. We confirmed the natural variability that exists in SCWMB that was in a previous image measured from these aerial surveys that they have worldwide. We found out that the day-to-day variability of the magnetic field didn't change much. We weren't expecting it to, but we wanted to make sure that with sediment movement and that kind of thing, that we weren't seeing day-to-day variability. And then the other thing I want to point out on this slide is figure D shows individual transects in our grid. And you can also see that across the site, there's big jumps in the background magnetic field. Even with no cable, we're seeing these big variations in the field that would maybe potentially hide a marine energy cable if you were to lay it in the background. And so this is kind of an interesting result because laying a marine energy cable might not look that different to a critter than sort of the natural variability that exists in a place like SCWMB. Next slide. So one of the big takeaways from our study is that the commercial magnetometer was a lot more straightforward to use and gave a lot more reasonable results than the sensor that we created. The inertial measurement unit, or IMU, didn't give accurate results in the configuration that we set up. And then we had a USBL and ultra short baseline that we attached to the C-SPY2 that we drug behind our boat. And we also don't necessarily recommend using that USBL to increase measurement accuracy. It just didn't really add location accuracy at the depths that we tested. What happened was that as we were dragging the C-SPY2 behind our boat, the wake and the bubbles from the boat ended up making it so that the acoustic signal got lost and wasn't as accurate as we hoped for. So we would recommend the C-SPY2 without an additional positioning system. Next slide. The next thing that I wanted to say about our unique site at SCWMB is that we also observed that there's a significant vertical change in the magnetic field. This was something that in the preliminary tests we noticed. And go to the next picture, Nolani. So those are the sites that we tested them at. And then you can see that as you, each of these is a vertical profile. So the top is the surface of the water and the bottom of the graph is the bottom of the ocean. And the magnetic field actually increases as you get closer to the bottom of the ocean. And so this is kind of an interesting result because knowing that magnetic field differs considerably, even just how far you are from the water, is an interesting result and important for if you're trying to detect a cable to make sure that you're having really consistent altitude of your sensor to take the most accurate readings. So at any site that you might want to characterize for understanding the effect of magnetic fields, we really recommend assessing the depth influence so that you can understand if you're seeing a difference in the magnetic field because of the altitude of your device, or if it's something else. Next slide. All right, so I think as I was going along, kind of said the recommendations that we found from these surveys, but I also want to highlight a couple of next steps that I think would be really helpful in this field. So the first thing is I'm really interested in creating a cable library to model how different types of cables would impact a background magnetic field. So we are currently surveying to understand all sorts of different marine energy developers' typical cables, and then making sure we understand the magnitude and profile of how those cables are typically used. So we would know the voltage and current that is running through them. And then from there, we can calculate the magnetic field theoretically. One of the cool things about calculating the magnetic field theoretically is we can also include calculations for if the cable is twisted. So most marine energy cables have a twisted pair of inside the cable. And so what that actually looks like is a dotted line of a magnetic field as opposed to a straight bright line. And so what I want to do with the cable library is be able to sort of lay out what that dotted line of magnetic field looks like inside the background magnetic field. So we have a full picture of what the impact and the magnetic field might look like to an organism. Another next step that we're hoping to do is to repeat all of this experiment with a cable that's planning to be installed in Squim Bay in 2023. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Nolani.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was wonderful to hear about. We do have, before we go into questions, we'll just go over some of the past webinars and future webinars. We are hosting Garrett Staines next month, and he'll talk about collision risk around marine energy devices. So we hope that you will join us for that. You can register by scanning the QR code, or I will include a link in the chat now. There are also ways to watch the past webinar, and you can access them through our YouTube playlist, which I also just included that chat. Some of our topics that we will be talking about in the future are underwater noise, changes in habitat, anthropogenic light, and energy sustainability, diversity and inclusion, and life cycle assessment next steps with multiple great speakers. So we hope you will join us for all of those. Also, our science communication expert, Kayleen Gunn, speaking of past speakers who just gave a great talk on science communication, which you can also access on the YouTube playlist. She has made many resources available on our website and in the Triton newsletter. You can find the Triton newsletter, the JMSE special issue with recent TFIT publications, including Molly's recent publication. It was just published this week. In the chat, you can find the link to that paper as well. Please do find that. Also, the Triton Stories blog and our YouTube playlist are all found at this link tree. So this QR code will take you there as well to find all of those resources. More to talk about, we have social media where we have really great stories and information about things that are happening with Triton. So if you follow at PNNL Lab on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, you'll find more events and recent goings on with Triton. With that, we are open to questions now. So if you would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat, or I will allow people to unmute themselves as well, just in case. And we already have one right off the bat. This is great. So will the cable library also include potential effects to marine life?
My goal is not necessarily to assess the potential effects to marine life, just to sort of give you the magnitude of the magnetic field that a cable would produce, and that a regulator or something else or someone else would be able to assess the impacts on marine life. But we do have another PNNL researcher who is hoping to do a study based on crabs. And she's going to do that in concert with some of the data that I collected and the cable that's going into Squim next year. And so she'll have a little bit more data on the potential effects to marine life coming soon.
Wonderful, thank you. I have allowed everyone to unmute if you would like to ask a question. Another question, what are the biggest questions you still have about EMF related to marine energy that you would like to explore in the future? Sorry, I messed up that question a little bit, but hopefully you got that. It's in the chat as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think that my biggest question is sort of, how do we start to assess the impacts of having multiple turbines or wave energy devices where you start to have an array with a bunch of different cables and how those cables are connected. I think there's a potential opportunity to sort of lay out the array and the cables to be more or less impactful on the environment. And it would be really cool to figure out kind of what that configuration might look like as we start to scale up.
Great, thank you. It looks like someone's unmuted themselves. If you want to ask your question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So one of the things about cables, especially quick connecting underwater, is what happens to the leads and if they're actually turned off before they're disconnected. And basically, I'm trying to investigate methods where the leads, any protuberances are actually withdrawn and through basically insulated receptors that dry the leads and then actually mechanically close the face of, I'm sorry to use these terms, but male and female parts of the connections. And so one of the things is about when you're doing underwater connections of mechanical systems that are moving from all the hydrodynamics, is trying to kind of like find the connection. And so basically thinking about conical kind of, if you will, the way lunar landing module connected to spacecraft that delivered it. It's kind of like this conical situation that allows for error of first connection. And then as it goes in toward the mating, basically gets closer and closer to the pin and receptacle connection point. So the big concern is basically how to flush out water to make a dry connection, and also how to mechanically protect the delicate electrical leads, you know, and basically that sensitivity level. So it's about quick mate. I'm thinking flush face kinds of things where they meet and then one pushes into the other and squeezes out seawater inside a tube, for example. And then the leads are shown there be like some sort of spongy material that it's kind of like a sponge basically that squeezes the water out and kind of wipes the leads and stuff like that. All right, so I'll stop blabbing, and I'm just curious if any of this in terms of EMF and protecting biota, etc. Are these being considered?
Yeah, thanks for that question and that really interesting sort of concept. I think that, you know, I really haven't focused much on the electric field because they're, you know, as you know, like typically kind of contained, except for in these situations where maybe there's a break in the cable or the leads come apart, like you were saying. So I have not considered those kinds of things, mostly sort of thinking about once the turbine's actually operating as opposed to sort of how you plug it in. But I'll think about it.
Well, yeah, this is related to not just loose cable, but encasing the cable in mechanical systems as in tube, yeah, with actually EMF protection all inside the tube, and basically protecting everything electrical from the environment, but integrating it into the mechanical system of the wave energy devices.
Yeah,
So,
great
so
idea, just not
electromagnetic
my
connection.
expertise. Yeah,
Thank you so much. We have another question from the chat from Rihanna. Is there any value in taking measurements to verify EMF calculations given the variations in the environmental magnetic fields surrounding a cable?
Yeah, so I assume that you're basically asking should we measure how the cable, what the magnetic field is in the cable separate from the environment, which is something that we've actually been thinking about doing, is a bunch of different marine energy cables, putting them in a tank to be able to get that magnetic field profile really well, so that we're not trying to find it in the background magnetic field. We know exactly what to look for. So that's something that we have been chatting about doing, and would be really cool to compare like a tank test of a cable with the theoretical magnetic fields for a cable. And apologies to get your question right.
Thank you. We have another question. First of all, congratulations on your new article, they said. And the question, would you say that these studies are helping to allow the deployment of MRE devices, or most of the projects, or are most of the projects still in the test stage?
Oh, definitely in the US, we still have mostly projects in the test stage. I think that for electromagnetic fields, one of the things that I am really interested in showing is that critters are naturally sort of able to deal with a lot of variation in the background magnetic field. And so maybe the low magnitude magnetic field that you're getting from these cables aren't that significantly different than what animals are seeing in nature. So that's sort of what I'm hoping. And so I'm hoping that these studies kind of show that maybe EMF isn't the biggest environmental risk that we would need to worry about when we're permitting these devices.
Perfect. Thank you, Molly. Another question, what would you learn from repeating the experiment with a cable installed?
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that I really want to learn, so okay, if we have our boat and we're doing our transects, back and forth to measure the magnetic field, what I'm really curious is, one, would we be able to see a signature of the cable? Like, would it look like, a nice little spike? Two, I'm interested if, after we do a transect, if we subtract the background magnetic field that we've already measured, would it show up that then you could see a nice little spike of the cable? So basically, I'm interested in verifying like methods for how to detect a cable. And then three, I'm interested in just sort of, again, kind of validating what our model says that the predicted magnetic field should be for a cable, and seeing if that's like impacted by the sediments in the field or not.
Okay, great. What would happen if there were an array of turbines with many cables?
I don't know yet, but we would have to be more careful about how we laid them out. So if regulators sort of did say that there's a significant impact to organisms and that maybe they don't cross cables, then we want to make sure that we laid them out in a meaningful way so that didn't impact migration or other parts of their life history. So I think we would want to know, one, what animals are we worried about in this particular scenario, and then kind of try to analyze how to best mitigate for those risks.
Perfect. So I haven't seen more questions in the chat. I would encourage people to post them now. We still have a few minutes, or unmute yourselves. Oh, here's one. What was the biggest challenge you faced during your field trials? Did you have an unexpected learning or outcome?
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges is finding out that the magnetic field really differed based on the altitude above the bottom of the ocean. And what we actually did was we ended up sending our commercial device back and having them add an altimeter. So previously, we just had a pressure sensor so that we knew what depth the device was operating at. And we thought that we would be able to easily sort of understand what altitude it was, you know, based on the approximate location and the pressure sensor. But there was enough. So the C-SPY comes, you have the boat, and then it drags behind the boat on a cord, right? And so there's some uncertainty in exactly the location of the C-SPY. And so between that location uncertainty and the pressure sensor, we couldn't actually accurately figure out what altitude we were at. And so it was really important to have the altimeter and made our calculations a lot more accurate.
Thank you. All right, I am going to go to the next slide, but if you do have a question, please feel free to ask it still. We have 2 more minutes. In the meantime, while you're thinking of more questions, we do have a survey that we would love for you to complete. I think it will take about 5 minutes or less. I've included a link in the chat. This really helps us understand what was valuable or what you'd like to learn in future webinars. So if you have a moment, please do take that survey. And if there's anyone who has another question, now is a great time. Okay, hearing none, this concludes our 4th session of the Triton Talks webinar series. Like I said, please do take 5 minutes or less to fill out our survey. We would love to hear your feedback. And thank you for joining, and we hope to see you in June for our next session. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.